Okay, welcome back everyone. We'll now begin the afternoon session. So hope you've enjoyed lunch and had a good networking session. I'd like to now introduce you to our first speaker of the afternoon session, and that is Georgie Somerset. So Georgie is a beef producer and a passionate advocate for rural and regional communities. Georgie is highly regarded as a leader in the agricultural sector, particularly for women in the industry, and she recently became General President of AgForce Queensland, the first woman to do so in AgForce history. Georgie currently serves on several boards, including the Australian Broadcasting Commission, the Royal Flying Doctor Service and Children's Health Queensland. When she isn't living out of a suitcase and attending to her many board commitments, Georgie loves being at home in the beautiful South Burnett region with her husband on their cattle property, and their 3 adult children regularly return home to be with them. So please join me in welcoming Georgie Somerset.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you for that. And it's a real pleasure to be here. It's a great crowd and really enjoyed the speakers that I could catch, and I'll do the catch-up on those. Long car trips are really good for listening to speeches because you often don't need to see the slides and you whack the podcast on and you catch up. So finding your voice. And as the youngest of 4 in a busy rural family, some, particularly my siblings, would say I had plenty of experience at a young age finding my voice. And indeed, I was very quick to contribute around the family table and the family discussions. And I was very quick to form an opinion and voice that. At one stage, my family, not so lovingly, nicknamed me 4GR after a Toowoomba radio station, as I was always on. We did have a good friend who was known to SM because his initials were SM. So primary school for me, I thought I'd go back and just share a little bit about where I came from, because I often think that my growing up has actually been quite formative to where I think I've ended up. And hopefully this won't be the end. I still feel like there's more to do. But it was all distance ed for me, or correspondence in those days, and just the final 2 years I had School of the Air when we moved to Western Queensland. But this meant that for me, education and life were intimately intertwined. I had parents who contextualised the daily news. Mum taught us, and what we were learning at the school desk was also what we were learning on the property, was what we were hearing on the news, what we saw in the community. And I really feel that some of that encouraged us to speak our mind at the time, but also to realise that everything is interconnected and that we do need to have something to say about things. It's ironic that I'm now on the ABC board, as my first letter to the ABC was in year 6 when I wrote to the news editor to let them know that Qantas was actually born in Winton, not in Longreach, and that it was conceived in Cloncurry, and could they please get their facts right. I received a lovely reply, which I still have, thanking me for that information. I really didn't imagine that I would, although it was one of those things that when I started to become a director, that you would say, oh, look, the ABC board would be fantastic. It's the most incredible honour, regardless of the last 6 months, to be there and working with an icon. My last 2 years of primary school were also spent with a lot of adults around me. I was the final one at home. Everyone else had headed to boarding school. And in fact, the eldest 2 came home in my final year of primary school to Longreach Pastoral College. So I was surrounded by a lot of adults and young adults for those last couple of years. On the property, school was always finished by lunchtime, none of this afternoon stuff. Community meetings, lots of things completed in the back of a meeting, regardless of what it was, and social gatherings. And I think I soaked up a range of opinions, ideas and stories. I was a great listener. Some would say it's inevitable that I found my voice, but I think it's been a much more circuitous route than I might have thought, than just being a bolshy pre-teen and being able to find what I could do. Over the years, I went away to boarding school, and I surrounded myself with the boarding school library. And I can't encourage you enough to encourage others to read. While it was an escape to read rural newspapers when I was 1,600 or more kilometres from home, It was also Wilbur Smith and Sydney Sheldon, to my mother's horror, Mary Stewart, look, anything that I could get my hands on. And it opened up to me that there was a whole other world out there, and I couldn't wait to discover that world as well. And the power of the vocabulary that you learn through all sorts of books. A teacher once said to me when I was raising my children, it doesn't matter what they're reading, even if it's the cornflake packet, as long as they're reading. And I look back on those years and think that D.H. Lawrence and William Collins and things from the 18th and 19th century, as well as really modern pieces, that helped me realise that there were other people out there. I'd grown up in a small rural community, in a sense, a very white community. And I realised that there were other communities out there. And I think reading is one of those gifts that helps us to find our voice. After boarding school, I headed home for the first couple of years, and that was an incredible experience to be based in Western Queensland and setting up a tourism operation for your parents when tourism was a fledgling industry. But what I inherited what I experienced was a community that was actually rich in gathering those in. And my first meeting of the Winton Outback Festival was in the Winton Bowls Club as a 17-year-old, where I found myself with roles and responsibilities and people who welcomed me in and felt that I had something to value. And they gave me a voice at that table. My parents also believed in me enough that they let me travel to Sydney and Melbourne on my own to visit coach companies. And I sat on a relative's living room in each city, cold calling coach companies and then hopping in a cab, travelling around the industrial estate in Western Sydney and Western Melbourne, calling in on coach companies and convincing them to come and visit Outback Queensland. We didn't have a bitumen road past Winton at that time, and in the mid-1980s, everybody went to Birdsville. There was no concept of going to Longreach and Mount Isa for tourism. Everyone went to Birdsville. And how much changes. But what gathered around me was people who actually gave me the chance to go down there. Cold calling is one of the most daunting things, I think. Is there anyone here who loves cold calling? I just think it's one of the most daunting things you do. But to learn to do it at 17, I also learnt about the kindness of strangers who actually did say, come and show me your quite basic photo album and tell me about what you've got to offer, who took great pity on me, I look back now. But what and can I just say, this is also bus travel. You didn't travel from Brisbane to Melbourne by plane back then. You travelled on the Greyhound. It was the 24-hour bus ride from Melbourne to Brisbane, and then you caught the 18-hour bus trip back out to Longreach. I was really fortunate that our community was tourism-minded at the time, and I realised the role that leadership could play. And it's no coincidence that Winton now has a thriving tourism industry with multiple festivals each year, a world-class Age of Dinosaur museum, world-class Waltzing Matilda. It's because back in the 70s, that shire and its leaders actually articulated that that's what they wanted to be part of their future. And they actually allowed people like me, as a bolshy 17-year-old, to come and sit at the table and give my ideas and be part of that, and really be part of that probably for the next 10 years. They're opportunities you look back on at the time you probably don't value, and I think of that often with young people now. We don't value when we're young the opportunities we're given. Distant shores beckoned me, those ones I'd read about, and after 12 months in the outback, I spent my summer, while everyone else was sweltering, I spent my summer in America, Europe and Hong Kong, and came back to what I thought was a much smaller Brisbane than had been when I left in November. It seemed that way after LA, Hong Kong and London. But what happened was I saw then how big the world could be and what opportunities were out there. And again, please encourage travel. I think when we understand our place in the world and how we sit globally, it helps us to find our voice right back in our communities. We understand what's special and precious about what we have, but we also understand that others have something to offer. I was exposed to art and history and welcoming homes and landscapes I could only imagine before I went there, and I had imagined often. And while those distant shores kept calling me, I did another year in the outback before I headed to Brisbane and did the normal thing of working for someone else. But by the time I was 20, I'd formed another business on my own in Brisbane, and some in this room are probably of the age that remember Expo 88, because that's when Brisbane grew up. And I was living in Brisbane at the time, working in tourism. It was just, I thought I had my dream job. I was selling rural Australia to the world, and the world had come to Brisbane. So I had 6 months of just, the world on a plate and working for myself. What more could a woman want? And I look back at that and think, most parents would just be completely horrified that their daughter has just given up a reasonably good job, knocked back being the final two in an interview that was going to employ 2 people, and is now parked up in her Petrie Terrace veranda with a very small word processor, a $3,500 fax that she's taken on a lease because she didn't have the money, and thinks she's going to run a marketing consultancy. But never a moment of doubt from my parents. Many phone calls to Winton, and I often say my husband, when I moved to Geelong, he inherited a phone bill as well as his wife-to-be. But going through those times were also interesting. I set up the first 2 industry bodies for farm tourism in Queensland and Australia. I didn't understand enough about how people ticked to be running industry bodies at the time. We'd do our teleconferences at 6 in the morning because it was cheaper then, before 8 o'clock. Remember those days? And I didn't know enough about how people ticked, and I think I ticked a lot of people off. I had places to go and people to see, and I wanted everything to happen yesterday. And it was a bit tricky at times. And I think at times I wondered whether I had the map to navigate what I wanted to do. I knew there was this whole world I wanted to conquer. I was all of about 20, 21, so I was a bit frustrated that things hadn't happened by then. I really wanted to be independent, but I needed my parents' support a lot of the time, but I knew that they weren't there, and I was bouncing business ideas off them. And then I found a mentor, and it was never called that in those days, and she would never have called herself that, but she was an incredibly wise friend who'd lived much of her professional life in America and had come back to Australia. So she was a Queenslander, and I had met her through tourism when she was living in America. She was just whip smart, and she had a great sense of humour, and was much older than me. Her son had grown up and left home. And when she moved back to Brisbane for what was her dream job in tourism, I won the jackpot, getting to know her at a time of life when I needed someone outside of my existing community who had no idea what pathway I was on. My friends were still at uni, and my other friends had gone to Lorraine Martin and were busy working 9 to 5. I was just working all over the place, and had great ideas on how to solve the problems of the world. And I'd do anything to sit with her now and just share with her how much she influenced me. And it wasn't in anything, there was never a mentoring session, and yet there were many mentoring sessions. She simply got on with doing the job and gave me so much of that. I learned about dedication to the task and not being constrained by the structures around you. Let's just change the way things are done if it doesn't work. Why don't we do it differently? Well, we could call it something else, rebadge it. But about having fun when you work and really valuing the people you work with, that work shouldn't be a chore. It should be something you absolutely love to be at. To not complain about having to work, but actually be thankful that you've got a job. And to make it enormous fun. One of her workplaces, there was sock day, and just the wildest, craziest socks would come to work. With and without dresses sometimes, like people would be in dresses and have socks because it was sock day. Just cherished people and the work she did, and was incredibly humble to boot. And so never underestimate the power you have to help other people find their voice by the influence you have through your work, your actions, and what's seen and what's visible to others, simply by what you're doing. I don't think people ever understand the full extent of the impact they can have. And for me, that was positive. There are negatives, but be willing to share generously with those who are coming through. For those are aspiring to something, it has enormous impact longer term. And I'm forever grateful that I won the jackpot with someone outside of my family. And I think these days it's much easier and we're more connected, and there's social media and formal processes. But how we can help people to find their voice is critical. It's about other people being with us and helping us. So for over 30 years now, 30 years last month, I've now run a variety of businesses from our cattle property at Geelong. And contrary to popular opinion, I do spend some nights of the week there. Not many during the week at the moment. At first, it was my marketing business. I simply packed up the word processor and the fax and I moved it out there and plugged it in. There was various consulting work as I found ways to enable communities to see their potential. I learned about regional development. I did freelance journalism for many years and I became the storyteller. And I became the teller of local stories and provided a voice for our region. I became a branded beef manager, and then throughout all of that, I was a wife, then a mother. I've been a daughter-in-law throughout, and they're all roles that I cherish above and beyond, as well as being part of our community. And finding my voice in all of those roles has been really interesting as well. These days I divide my time between the property and various board roles, and it's such a different pace to where I might have imagined I'd be, and yet bizarrely, it's exactly where I imagined I'd be many years ago. You know, those little dreams you have, or those articles you read and you think, yep, I could do that. And in some ways what I'm doing now is exactly what I thought I could do, but never probably at the time thought would transpire. When you live 350 k's from Brisbane, you don't always think that these things are going to happen. During those years, I've lost my voice and I've known silence, and yet I've found it again. And I've learnt new languages and some new dialects in there as well. I've learnt to invest in learning, and I've kept adding to that vocabulary. That's been critical for me. And so now I see my role as helping organisations find their voice. Directors' role is to set the strategic direction of an organisation, and then support the CEO to work with management to carry out that strategic direction. It's essentially bringing to life a vision for an organisation, and I'm incredibly fortunate to do it across purposeful organisations at the moment, and help them have that voice in what they do. And when I reflect back on how that voice has evolved, I can see the path quite clearly from this end. From parents who let me speak up, from friends who challenged me constantly, often late at night, and I was being quite opinionated, to peers who shared new dialects, and mentors like the one I mentioned who, I guess, gently moulded me to have not quite as harsh a view, to be kinder, and to learn new phrases. I've moved into industries with completely new languages, like the beef grading system or the health industry finance. Oh, look, Bridget, you'd love some of my board papers. And corporate governance. They're languages I now feel much more proficient in, but I'm constantly learning. And as president of our industry group, AgForce, I now provide a voice for my members. While they focus on growing fantastic food and fibre, my job is to find a way to have their voices heard while they get on with the job. Sometimes this is through me, sometimes it's through what we do, but it's a critical voice. I think we all have a voice and we can help others find theirs. And I didn't find mine in an echo chamber. I found it because I shared it with others, and often they didn't agree with me. And I've learnt not to worry as much about the people who don't agree, but to learn from that, and actually to ask them, why don't you agree? I can learn a lot from the people who don't agree with me. In fact, the people who agree with me don't challenge me as much. So I've learnt so much from the people who challenge me and push back. Test your voice, learn a new language. It's International Women's Week, so be proud of it. Be proud of the voice you've got and speak up for what you believe in. Find a way to connect with others at whatever level it is. We have multiple roles in society and in businesses, and I know that each of you can find the voice that's right for you. Keep investing in yourself and listen to others, older and younger. Really listen, catch their phrases, thread the sentences together, and help connect like voices together. Don't simply throw your words to the wind. Find the right breeze and help that breeze carry you along as you find your voice, grow your story, and know your own language. Thank you. Sneak down here.
So do we have a few questions for Georgie?
Why not?
Just get away.
I'm going to get off lightly.
Any questions? Yes.
Georgie, I'm wondering what you say to people who ask you regularly what do you do to relax or when do you rest?
I shouldn't say I go home because I should be working when I go home. I just love nothing more than getting home. I don't actually need to go on holidays at the moment. I had 6 weeks at home over Christmas and that was magic for me. So to be back on my veranda and just be able to centre myself, I actually need that downtime. But for me it is about being back on the property. I have so little time there at the moment, but that's actually for me almost sort of the recreation. I love to travel, I love to explore new places, but I'm doing so much of that with work that I'm really content to actually be home and surrounded by family and friends or just alone on the veranda.
Georgie, how you going?
Hi, Maggie.
Well done again. You've had a major role that I've seen ever since I've been up here, which has been a while in Queensland now, with the Queensland Rural Remote Women's, and you've been such a leader in that. And yeah, do you want to reflect on that and how you think that's helped people and helped you, and where you think it's still going?
Yeah, and I didn't list off everything, but the Queensland Rural, Regional and Remote Women's Network, as it's now known has had a huge impact on my life because it surrounded me with really wise women. So we founded in 1993 and then I was president for 5 years finished up about 4 years ago. I think the gathering of women to share information was incredibly powerful for me at a time when there were probably quite traditional roles for women in the early mid-90s, but we were going through quite a significant drought then at the time as well. That's the one Roger said the other day, 91, finished in 96. Yeah, I remember that one. And there really wasn't room to not include women. We needed everyone at the table to try and solve problems. And so I just got surrounded by these incredibly wise women who were much older than me, who were incredibly generous. And it showed me the power of banding together to change, to bring about change. So in 1993, the Department of Ag, DPI in those days, couldn't actually send a letter to women. The database only had Mr. in it. There was no Mrs. or Ms. So we just, really simple things. So it was no wonder no women were turning up to consultations or meetings because they weren't invited. They couldn't be invited. So really simple things like that to significant meetings with politicians and senators and getting women informed. I think information is powerful when it's shared. So I think in a way, QRN helped women find their voice and it's continuing to do that. Bridget reflected this morning on the Wire program. It came out of a lunch I had with a researcher from USQ and I said, it's women in rural businesses that actually need support. They need to be able to get together and have hubs and be challenged and held accountable. So it's lovely to hear you doing all that, Bridget. So QRN has had an enormous impact on my life and I think it's surrounding yourself with people who do test and challenge you as well as support you. Thanks, Maggie.
Okay, I think we'll leave it there. So there's a lot of common themes that certainly come through the presentations today.